Good afternoon and welcome to the latest good afternoon and welcome to the latest Milwaukee Press Club virtual newsmaker. Today we have Wisconsin's most popular pollster, Charles Franklin. We'll get back to him in a minute. First, I want to thank our sponsors. We have presenting sponsors, I'm a mess today, Spectrum News 1. We have sustaining sponsor, Miller Quas. And our event partner, WisPolitics. WisPolitics partners with the Press Club for this luncheon as part of its ongoing event series in Milwaukee, sponsored by UW Milwaukee, Wisconsin Academy of Global Education Training, 1125 at Pabst, Milwaukee Police Association, the Firm Consulting, and the Medical College of Wisconsin. So once again, our guest today is Charles Franklin. Charles has directed the Marquette University Law Poll since its inception in 2012. The poll is the most extensive in state polling. Charles has also founded Pollster.com and is a member of the ABC News Election Night Analysis Team. Charles, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here. Good to be back virtually, if not in person.
Introduce yourself a little bit more before we get started.
Okay. I'm Charles Franklin. I'm director of the Marquette Law School Poll. We started the Marquette poll in January of 2012 in a nice quiet year when nothing was going on politically in the state. And things haven't particularly quieted down since, all the way till this past week. You know, in that time, we've done now 65 statewide polls, plus 2 of the Milwaukee area and region, and more recently, 2 national polls about attitudes towards the U.S. Supreme Court, part of a probably continuing series on the court. This year, as you may have heard, we had a presidential election. In our final results, we had Biden leading by 5. Over the course of the last 4 polls, we had Biden by 4 or 5 points in each of those. He's winning the state by about 0.6%. So we're off by about 4 points. We also, in the final release, included a high turnout model that was expecting about 3.2 million turnout. And we're a little bit above that even. Our normal model assumed about 3.1 million. And in that high turnout model, we had a 4-point margin. That's not meaningfully different from 5, but it does suggest that higher turnout was favorable to Trump and did move our margin just a little bit in his direction. So I would say we were off by 3 or 4. I think one of the things I talked about all year long was characterizing our results as showing a modest but consistent Biden lead of 4 or 5 points, and that we saw no trend in that lead throughout the year. Indeed, no trend of it since August of 2019, when we first started asking horse race questions. I also pointed out that there was some bifurcation in the polling in the state, because there were a lot of polls in the 8 to 11 point range. And by different high quality national and state pollsters that sort of consistently showed a higher margin than we had. And at least a couple of those had been down near where we were over the late summer, early fall, but showed a move up to that 9 or 10 or 11 point Biden lead. So those polls, I think, together created both the average high for Biden here, considerably above where we were. And then there's the ABC Washington Post poll at 17, which I frankly think is so obviously an outlier that it should just be completely discounted. But it is a bright, shiny object, and I see it getting mentioned virtually every time polling is mentioned. That one's held up as one of the examples. But I think it's far less worrisome because anybody can get a bad sample. But the question of why we had this cluster of not 1 or 2, but several good quality polls in that 8 to 11 range is dominating the perception of how off the polls were here. A side question is, why were we off by 3 or 4? Our long-term average error is about 2. So on the one hand, we were way better than we were in 2016 when we had Clinton up by 6, Trump won by just under 1. So we had a full 7-point error and the wrong winner in 2016. This time we have the right winner and we're off by 3 or 4, depending on turnout. And that's a lot better than the average. But the question is, why was the average so big? Why was there this bifurcation in the polls? And that's a little bit of a puzzle. Also, I should mention Fox News in their polling here, national Fox polls, actually showed a tightening race. They had had it about an 8-point Biden lead, but their final poll actually came down to where we were at 5. So it's not universal that polling moved up roughly following the first debate, but more polls moved up than moved down, and Fox stands out as the one that came back down and ended up being right where we were at the end. So that's the sort of story. It's still early to diagnose what went wrong. I'm happy to talk about some theories, and I have 2 major hypotheses about it. And we can talk about that. But I also think I at least would like to talk about some of the vote patterns in the state. Granted, the vote isn't certified yet, but I think we have a very good idea of how the state voted, how it changed from last time, and how some of those changes in vote are reshaping the geopolitical map, if I can use that term slightly tongue-in-cheek, of Wisconsin and where areas are shifting. So I hope we can talk about that. But by and large, I'm in your hands, and I'm happy to take any and all questions.
Well, great. I'm guessing our journalists want to get into your theories a bit. So let's meet them. We have Charles Benson from TMJ. We've got Craig Gilbert from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and Adrian Peterson from WISN 12. And I'm going to go away because you don't want to hear from me anymore. So have at it, Charles.
All right, Professor Franklin, thanks for making time for us. Let's get to that question on what went wrong. And when you look at that last poll, you had Biden 48%, Trump at 43%. When you look at the results right now, I think we're at 49.6% for Biden, and then rounding it off to 49% for Trump. So when you look at those numbers, you can make the case, boy, you were pretty close to dead on for Joe Biden, but off on Trump. So my question is it hard for pollsters to identify Trump supporters? And when you're looking at a balance between Republicans and Democrats and independents, do Trump voters see themselves as outside of all of those lanes?
I think this is very close to what I'm thinking is hypothesis number 1 about what's going on in polling. I'm going to give you a somewhat lengthy answer with apologies. To cut to the chase, I think there's more evidence now than there was 4 years ago that we're missing a small but not trivial group of people who support Trump, but are not strong Republicans and may not participate in elections outside of ones where President Trump is on the ballot. And here's the evidence for that. In 2016, we were within a decimal point of Hillary Clinton's final vote, but we were badly too low on Trump. We missed him by over 7 points. That was where all of our error came from in 2016, was in this very substantial understatement of the Trump vote. Now, it does look like much of that was coming from suburban areas of the state where I think there was a genuine reluctance, ambivalence, let's say, about Trump, but a deep antipathy to Hillary Clinton that I think in the end did bring these folks home to Trump. That's a slightly different story than what I think is the case this year. If you flash forward to this year, you mentioned our final percentages, but those were the ones that included the undecided and the people that declined to answer. Obviously, in the actual vote, those people are counted in there. And so one of the things we did this time in response to the errors from 16 is we allocated the undecided and declined to vote by looking earlier in the questionnaire. We have asked people, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of Trump and of Biden? So if you were undecided or declined to say, and there were more that declined to say than anything else, if you were favorable to Biden but not favorable to Trump, we allocated that to a Biden vote. And we did the reverse, favorable to Trump, not favorable to Biden, we gave to Trump. And finally, that left about 3% that we couldn't allocate based on that. Most of those folks were unfavorable to both. So it really doesn't give us a clue as to which way they might ultimately vote. So we just left them as unknown or undecided. But when we do that, we have Biden at 50 and he's getting 49.6. And we have Trump at 45. That's the same 5-point margin. So it didn't shift our margin at all. But it does bump both Biden and Trump up by 2 points. Biden at 50, as I said, 0.4 of a point away from his vote. But Trump at 45, and he's at 48.9 currently. So 3.9 points, still too low. The good news from my point of view is we cut our error on Trump by about in half from 4 years ago. But the bad news is there's still this understatement of his vote. So we've got two Democrats almost exactly right and systematic understatement of Trump. Go ahead, Charles.
So on that front, you mentioned suburbs as potentially that small margin or trying to navigate through that. But what about African Americans or Hispanic Latinos who that went for Donald Trump? Are you missing that?
That's a good question, and I don't have a good answer for it at this point. You know, as you know, it's really hard to get a definitive count of how any demographic group votes other than by polling. And you can use exit polls, but exit polls have their own problems, maybe more problems than pre-election polls do. What I can tell you in our data is that when we aggregated a lot of surveys, so we would have a significant number of cases of both Black and Latino voters, we were seeing the Black vote for Biden in the 80s, and for Trump just under 10%. But that left about 11, is that right? Yeah, about 11% or maybe a shade less that were undecided, might not vote, unallocated in some way. And we don't, again, have much information about them. That was in line with what polling had shown in 2016 in their presidential vote. So I didn't see much evidence of a big shift one way or another. When we look at Black party identification, we also see no discernible growth in Republican identification, stays under 10%. But we do see a little bit of a climb in independent identification among African Americans in the state. Whether that's a generational thing or something else, it's hard to say. But the point is, I don't see any evidence of a general shift in the Black vote. Now, when we look at the aldermanic ward returns from the city this time, in the predominantly Black wards, so in Ward 1, which is 80% Black, the margin for Clinton was 86%. The margin for Biden is 84%. Okay, that's the margin now. It's not the Democratic vote, it's the whole margin. So down 2 points. If we look at the 7th, which is 84% Black, it dropped 3 points from 90 to 87. And if we look at the 15th, which is 80% Black, it dropped from 91 to 87, down 4. So across those 3 wards, anywhere from a 2 to 4% shrinkage of the margin. There was also a bit of a decline in voter turnout in those wards, which is a little surprising given all the emphasis that's gone into mobilizing the Black community. In the 2 Hispanic predominant wards, the 8th at 70% Hispanic. It dropped more from a 63% Clinton margin down 7 points to a 56% Trump Biden margin. And in the 12th, which is 71% Hispanic, dropped 8 points from 68 to 60. So now there's always danger in using these geographies. We can't say that these vote changes were all Hispanics changing their votes. It could have been a more mobilized white voters that are minority population within those wards. So care is definitely needed on this. But on the face of it, it looks like a slight decrease in Democratic margins in the Black areas of the city and a somewhat larger 6 or 7 point drop in the Hispanic areas of the city. Turnout was generally down in Black areas, and it was a more mixed pattern in Hispanic areas. The big rises in turnout and rises in the Biden margin are in the predominantly white areas along the lakeshore.
Craig? Unmute.
You're on mute. And now you're on video mute as well, Craig. This is great. Go right ahead.
Can you hear me now? When you look at the regional vote patterns around the state, and you look at the regional patterns in your polling, are you finding that your polling was closer to capturing the vote in some parts of the state than it was in other parts of the state?
Yeah, this is not final, so I want to label it that way. But it looks like we were much better in the suburban areas of the state this time. Looks like we were good in the Madison media market. It looks like we're off a fair bit in the Green Bay area. Now, in Green Bay, we were off last time, not as much as we were in the WOW counties and the Milwaukee suburbs, but we were off in Green Bay last time. There's some changes going on in that area. And so I'm at the moment a little unclear about how much our errors are coming from the more rural parts of the Green Bay media market and how much is being affected by Brown, Outagamie, and Winnebago counties, which are, as we'll get to at some point, trending a bit more Democratic in their votes. But the more rural parts of the Green Bay market are moving in a strongly Republican direction. So there's sort of a mixed picture there, but I think we will be too low by a fair bit there. And then in the north and the western part of the state, this is the Wausau market, the La Crosse Eau Claire market, the Twin Cities, and Duluth Superior all combined. We had a surprisingly close margin in our polling, and it looks like that's a pretty substantial Trump win in that region. So whereas last time we seemed to do fairly well in the north and west and the Madison area, but we're off in the Milwaukee suburbs by quite a bit and off in the Green Bay area by less, but still off. It looks like we did better in the Milwaukee suburbs this time, but are more off in that north and west and to some extent in the Green Bay area.
And is that pattern consistent with some of the prevailing theories about what went wrong with the polling?
Well, here it's a bit of a mixed picture. I think there is some that's consistent. We're seeing a bit of a greater urban-rural divide, but I want to make it a little more picky. Looking at the aggregate vote returns that we have as of now here in the state, but more importantly, nationally across all counties, it looks like it's both urban and suburban counties that moved in a Biden direction. And it's the ex-urban and rural counties that moved in a Trump direction. So, you know, the shorthand is urban-rural, but really it looks like the suburbs are joining the urban areas in a more Democratic direction, and the exurbs are becoming the more solidly Republican area that stereotypically we've thought of the suburbs as being. That fits with the geographic pattern of change here in the state. So I mentioned Brown, Outagamie, and Winnebago counties. Those are mixed areas. They have significant cities within them as well as countryside. But those three counties as a group voted less Republican this time than they had done for Trump 4 years ago. In that they joined the WOW counties as shifting in a Democratic direction, though their shifts was less than what we've seen in the WOW counties and later coming than what we've seen in the WOW counties. But that leaves most of the shift in the North and West in counties that did move in a Trump direction and seem to have moved more than what we were expecting from our polling data. It's worth knowing we did not see a partisan imbalance in the polling in those areas. So we haven't seen evidence of a growing Republican majority in those areas compared to earlier years.
Thank you. Adrian?
Thank you so much for doing this with us, and we really appreciate your insight. And one thing I know that you've heard is that the president has been calling some of these polls that missed the mark suppression polls. The thought being that, let's say you got in line to vote, and then you are, you're sick of waiting or something, and then you think, hey, my person's not going to win anyway. I saw the polls, so I'm just going to get out of line. What's your response to that?
Yeah, well, that was also something we heard from Democrats after 2016, but in reverse, that it was the front runner whose voters said, why bother? We take this for granted. This is a common theme in politics. It's always been an issue. This is not unique to Trump, that both the front runner and the trailing candidate have equally plausible but exactly opposite explanations of what a big lead in the polls means. The candidate that's trailing says, this means my voters are discouraged so they don't turn out. But the candidate that's leading says, this means my voters will take the win for granted and not turn out. And so they're both predicting opposite things. When we look over the long haul, looking at all Senate, gubernatorial, and presidential elections at the state level, and all polls in those races from 1998 to 2016, the last time I updated this, there's not a systematic pattern of front runners falling short of the polls or trailing candidates falling short or exceeding their vote. So it doesn't look like there is an effect of the polls being systematically wrong. The one exception to that is that in true blowout states where the polls are showing a 30% majority, this is like the kinds of polls you get in a typical election in a hugely Democratic state or a hugely Republican state. There is a tendency for the race to be a bit closer than those giant blowouts suggest. But we're not talking about a poll showing you leading by 10. We're talking about polls that show a 20-point margin or more. So I don't think there's evidence that voters are in general checking the polls, let alone checking them on election day, and coming to the conclusion that they shouldn't vote. That said, there was certainly plenty of talk after the 2016 election in the belief that this led Clinton voters to take the election for granted and to vote for the third parties or the Greens or to not vote. And so, if Trump thinks that this was polling that hurt his campaign, there was also a lot of talk about that in Clinton's case 4 years ago. But the empirical evidence is not very persuasive that polling leads systematically leads you to win by even more than what the polls said. And of course, this time it's exactly the opposite. The race turns out a lot closer in almost every state than the polls said. So, for President Trump's story to be true, you would have thought it was Republicans who were discouraged from turning out. But in fact, the races were closer. So if it was in any way that, it would have been Democrats that dropped out.
And a quick follow-up to that. So between 2016 and then now 2020, with so much attention being put on these polls and people talking about them, I'm wondering if you've received any more backlash than you have in years past, or God forbid, anything serious like threats or anything.
No,
like that.
nothing like that. There's always a bit of Twitter chatter. It seems possibly just a shade more organized this time, but I'm happy to say we don't get a lot of that. And I got to also speak up for the other side. We get notes saying, I watched your poll. I saw it was off. I have these comments and suggestions about what you might do better. I kind of cherish those kinds of things. Those are folks that are engaged about it. They're not uncritical, but they're actually trying to be helpful and bring their perspective. And those notes, if I counted them up, are at least as common as the ones that say your poll is bogus and you should quit polling. So, but both of them are fairly small, but I'm happy with the balance that I get.
I think as working journalists, we could all agree that it's always nicer to get the kind feedback on how we can do better, and not that you should quit your job. Charles Benson, I'll send it over to you.
Thanks. Professor Franklin, we in the media tend to focus on the horse race, the big headline numbers, but all of your polls also give us an indication on people's point of views for how well a candidate or president or governor is doing on their job, as well as on issues, the pandemic, the economy. So when you go down ballot, so to speak, in polls, is there a sense that those could be more accurate, or are they off as well?
Well, I think this is an important question. And, one way to think about the horse race question is it's one of the rare questions on any survey that we can match up and say, did this reflect the actual outcome, right? In a weird way, that's why getting the horse race right is so especially important for pollsters. It's not to predict the election, though, of course, we'd like to get it right, but it's because it shows you that you're doing something pretty close to accurately reflecting reality. That's why I think the failures these last two presidential races are a big deal, and they're not to be lightly dismissed or treated as inconsequential. I don't actually think the polling world is doing that, but I think it is important and not to be diminished. We do check some things that have external validation. And so some of the concerns I have, if a small segment of Trump voters are systematically declining to participate in the poll, that can account for why we are systematically understating Trump's vote. And that's one of the theories I'll be working on for the next few years, to try to find a way to know if that's true or not. But they're a small enough group that it might not affect some of the other percentages in the poll. And I'll give you just two quick examples, but we do these routinely. And I think after this year, I'll be looking for even more chances to do it. We were asking, have you already voted, throughout our two October polls? And in the second poll, the end of October, we finished interviewing on Sunday night, and we had 41% who had said they had already voted, either absentee or by in person. Monday morning at 7:30, the Elections Commission had that number at 37.5. And on Tuesday morning at 7:30, they had it 40.5. And so I took that as really satisfying evidence that we were in fact tracking with early votes pretty well. The other one we do, and not that we deliberately set out to do it, but in response to our question about worry about getting COVID, we allow people to volunteer that they've already had COVID. And as a result, we now have 5 polls that track that number. And we're within about a percentage point of what the state estimates as the percentage of the adult population that have had COVID. So those are just 2 examples of where you can link the poll to an external reality and see if we're wildly wrong. And those 2 examples, we weren't wildly wrong. I don't think we were wildly wrong on the vote, but obviously we were systematically a bit wrong. And I think that's a way that pollsters in general can get those sorts of external validations, aside from just waiting every 2 or 4 years to get an election to benchmark that.
So when you look at that, I think Atlantic Monthly did a story about this, why there is risk in people not believing or trusting in polls, because they do give us a sense of what people are thinking about other issues. And so if you were to take a poll on, do you trust polls, the numbers might not look good. And why is there a downside to that?
Yeah, I think that, look, my involvement in polling in large part comes from the idea that this is part of our broad civic conversation that's part of being a republic, that it's important for us to hear what everybody is thinking, and polling is one way to get at it. Going out and interviewing people is another way to get at it. There's plenty of ways that we try to have that civic conversation, but polling is one way to do it, and at its best, at its aspirational best, we are accurately representing the entire public that we're trying to sample. And as you mentioned, we're covering a host of issues beyond just the horse race. We typically ask about 40 substantive questions in each survey, and seldom are more than 8 or 10 of those about the horse race itself. And so that's our attempt to further that civic conversation. The other point, I was on public radio the other day, and a very nice caller said, I hope you won't be offended, but maybe you just shouldn't do polling at all. And her point was that maybe polling is not helping the public. But my response is that if we didn't have public polling, whether done by universities or done by media organizations or other independent but public polling, then the only people that had it would be the parties and the campaigns and the interest groups. And those organizations are intrinsically self-interested with no reason to release information that's not favorable to their interests. So for that reason, I think in the same way that we don't want media organizations that are wholly owned subsidiaries of parties or interest groups, we don't want polling to only be available to those who have a strong self-interest in paying for it. I'm not really worried about polling going away, but I am very worried about the damage that these last two elections do to the credibility of polling and our ability to reflect what the public thinks.
Greg?
So Charles, since the election, there have been claims made without any real evidence that there's something sort of suspicious or implausible about some of the election numbers we're seeing in Wisconsin or different parts of Wisconsin, and similar claims about other states. And I just wondered, as somebody who's spent a fair amount of time studying voting patterns in Wisconsin, whether you've run across any particular results at the regional or local level that strike you as inherently suspicious or implausible?
Yeah, I have not. I think that historically, if we look back, the cases that we've seen big surprises have in fact turned out to be mistakes. Think of the Waukesha County vote in the 2011 Supreme Court race. That was very consequential because it flipped the state majority, but it was discovered and reported and dealt with within whatever it was, a couple of days of the election. That's, to me, the biggest example I can think of something like that. Other things are completely routine. The fact that the absentee vote is reported very late or very early on Wednesday morning is designed into the system that says you can't start processing absentees until Election Day. And it virtually guarantees that in big places, especially those with centralized vote counts, that we're not going to get them processed until late. And I think, implausible that that is anything other than simply the way the system has been designed. And indeed, those cities asked to be able to process the votes ahead of time, and that permission was not forthcoming. And so to then turn around and say this is shocking, I think is simply to ignore the way the system has been intentionally designed. I've offered a modest editorial opinion of hoping that we might have some level of bipartisan reform in the coming year to address the simple administrative tasks of elections, to make that process go smoother and less surprisingly on these orders, but I'm not overly optimistic about that happening. Also, we've seen some truly misleading things about the turnout levels, with, I think, either an unintentional or a malicious comparison of the percentage turnout of registered voters versus the percentage turnout of all adult eligible voters. Those are dramatically different percentages, and there's certainly been a variety of tweets and things comparing the two inappropriately. When we look at the turnout levels by the same metric, then our turnout level was high this time, but it's not unusually high. In fact, as I think you've pointed out, it falls slightly below the percentage turnout of voting age population that we had in 2004. And so we're up a few percentage points from last time, but not at all outside the normal range of variation. And then there are some long-term trends that produce big numbers. The growth of the Democratic margin in Dane County is an example of that, but that's a margin that's been growing steadily and kind of jaw-droppingly big for years. And so again, the fact that we got a substantial tick up in the Dane County margins is exactly what you expect from one of the most democratic areas and the county that's had the fastest population growth for more than a decade. Yeah, the vote's going up and it's becoming more democratic. And they are kind of big numbers, but they're right in line with what we've been seeing in the trend. So all of those things lead me to say I have not seen anything in the numbers that strikes me at all as implausible. There might still be something that comes up in the canvas that involves a transposition of digits. You know, you type in 8-1 instead of 1-8, and that can change a number quite a bit. But I haven't seen those yet.
Do you have any expectations as a pollster as to how broadly the election results will be accepted on both sides of the political divide?
Well, normally I would say they will be. There's a lot more rhetoric from President Trump and from Republican allies, including here in the legislature, proposing really unheard of things. And I don't know how much traction those things will end up getting. If we can trust the polls, there's one set of polling just in the last day or two that shows large percentages of Republicans doubting that the election was free and fair. I think the number's in the 70% range, but I'm not certain of that. On the other hand, there's another poll that's showing a pretty solid majority of the country saying that Joe Biden is the winner, and that includes 50% of Republicans. I might be a little concerned that 50% of any group disagrees that we know who that winner is, but I think that is less worrisome. And finally, some folks have gone back and looked at 2016 and noticed that it was Democrats who thought the election had not been free and fair. And so maybe this is more about the losing side pretty often does have doubts, but I don't think you can separate that from the very unusual rhetoric that we're seeing from Republicans at this point. And it does sow doubt about the legitimacy of the election, about the electoral process. And when we start talking about electoral college votes being changed, I think we are threatening the foundations of the republic in ways that I cannot remember happening in my lifetime.
Thanks, Charles. Adrian?
So I'm curious in terms of, I was reading that the way you go about this poll is reaching people via cell phone or landline. And I'm wondering if there's any thought to changing that in the future, if you've had discussions on it in terms of, thinking about who has a landline to begin with these days, and then people not maybe answering unknown numbers or not trusting who's on the phone. What about the way you go about with the poll?
Yeah. No, that's absolutely great. We do a variety of things actually in sort of research and development mode. We remain a telephone-based survey because I believe that is still the best method, but we are experimenting with other alternatives. In our calls, we do about 65% of the interviews with cell phones. Only about 35% are still landline. And there are reasons to keep some landlines in there. Federal statistics suggest that about 65 or 70% of the state is now cell phone only, but about 90%, 92% have a cell phone. But it means that a lot of people are reachable by cell phone, as well as some segments still, 35% or so, that are reachable by landline only, not only, but by landline. So it's a good mix for us. And actually the differences between cell phone and landline respondents has been decreasing over time. So it's a less critical component, but I can imagine the day fairly soon when we're doing 80% by cell phone. That's a moving target, but it's easy to take care of. And it's just as easy for us to sample cell phones as it is to sample landlines. So there's no difference in the quality of the samples. This June, we did a survey in parallel with our June telephone survey over the same days, in which we first reached respondents by text message, sending a text to a random sample of numbers, inviting them to participate in an online version of exactly the same survey we were doing by telephone. So this is a research and development project. We did not report the results along with our June survey, but we're analyzing the differences between those two, looking for how well did the text to web survey, as it's called, how well did that capture the public? Where were we similar? Where were we different compared to the cell phone? And in September, in our national Supreme Court survey, we conduct that survey online, but respondents are sampled from their US postal addresses. And so you can get a list of all of the addresses in the country that the post office delivers mail to. You draw a random sample of those addresses and you send them an old-fashioned paper envelope, a letter that invites them to go to a website with a unique ID, so only they can take part in the survey. And in that way, you get a random sample of the population, but you just interview them online. That method is working pretty well at the national level. It's not yet clear that it works equally well in a much smaller state and in a state where regions of the state have less adequate internet access. And so that too is something that I can well imagine us turning to at some point. So bottom line is there are a lot of methodologies out there being tested. And we're trying all of them. We're watching what other organizations are doing and what success they have. And the issues of phone are very real. The reluctance of people to pick up unknown numbers, that's a big deal. The cell phone landline is not a big deal anymore, but the reluctance to pick up is. So all of these things are things we're actively working on, but we want to make any changes based on clear evidence from the data, rather than rushing to try a new methodology and embracing it until it's proven itself.
Corey, I didn't know if this is where we...
Sense. Thank you to the other Charles now.
Corey, I didn't know if this is where you want to jump in with questions from the audience, or do you want us to keep going?
Well, I sure can, unless you guys have more questions.
Well, we do, but I didn't know if we're doing an hour here and you were going to leave 15 minutes for...
You know what? You guys can go ahead and ask a few more questions, and then
Okay,
I can jump in about 5 minutes.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
Professor Franklin, so I look back at your last poll before the governor's race, and it said it was 47-47, and it turned out to be a very, very close race. When I look at polls that, quote, got it right, I look at the Des Moines Register, right, just days before the election, I think they surprised people by saying Trump up by 7%. Trafalgar, I think, got a lot of press out there because it looked like they were closer. Do you see something on what you did 2 years ago in the Des Moines Register poll and some of these others that got closer? What do you take away from those when you do get it right?
Yeah, I think that the marginal changes we made helped us get that gap from 7 points down to 3 or 4. So I do think at the margin we improved, but that improvement was in part in urging people to tell us who they were going to vote for a little bit more, and in one case, allocating the undecideds to get a better estimate. But I think at the margin that improved. The Des Moines Register poll is interesting because they had shown Biden ahead by a lot in their earlier polls, and then their final poll came back to very close to the correct answer. So it's not that they had always shown the Republican advantage in Iowa. Instead, they had not earlier, and then they did. In Georgia, it looks like the polling average error is quite small, maybe as little as 1 percentage point. At this point, I don't have a good answer for why different organizations ended up close, like Seltzer did, or why the polling average was pretty good, like in Georgia it was. But it was good in Georgia, it wasn't good in Florida. You know, why the difference? I'm sorry to say that we just don't know at this point. You mentioned the 2018 poll, and I want to come back to that, though, because what I was saying earlier about we're getting the Democratic vote right in the 2 presidential races, but we're missing on Trump. In 18, we were within 1.1 of the governor's race. We were within 1/10 of a point of the Senate race in 18. And this spring in the Democratic primary, we were within 2 points of both Biden and Sanders votes. What's the difference? Donald Trump is not on those ballots. Now, this would be consistent with my hypothesis that we are missing some small set of Trump supporters who are not necessarily Republicans, but who are declining to take part in the survey systematically, but who also come out to vote for Donald Trump, but are not intrinsically politically active, and they're not intrinsically Republican coming out to vote for Republican candidates if Trump is not on the ballot. I don't have the ultimate evidence for that. I think these differences in when we've been right and when we've been wrong over these last 4 years, though, is certainly a key part of the evidence for the puzzle, because our methodologies are not different in 2018 or in the presidential primary than they were in the 2 November votes. And our methodology obviously wasn't different in getting the Clinton vote and the Biden vote dead on, but then missing on Trump. So that's why I think it has to have something to do with Trump voters. And I think it has to do with missing some less active voters who only come out for Trump, but also are reluctant to take part in surveys.
Craig?
Yeah, Charles, your polling has consistently shown that Wisconsin's almost evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to registered voters. In the exit polls in Wisconsin this time around, I believe it showed that Republicans had like a 4 or 5 point advantage in terms of the share of the electorate they comprised compared to Democrats. And in AP's alternative to the exit polls, VoteCast, it showed an even bigger advantage for Republicans in the composition of the Wisconsin electorate. Now, I know there's a lot of skepticism about some of the data in these kinds of polls. And I just wondered if those seem plausible to you, that we could have a 4 or 5 point lean in a Republican direction in the Wisconsin electorate in an election in which Donald Trump lost. And obviously that's not a number we're used to seeing in Wisconsin. Whether you think it's plausible that there was a Republican tilt at all in the electorate and a tilt that large.
Yeah, I'm pretty skeptical of it, but aside from the fact that exits or VoteCast, both certainly VoteCast is a new and very interesting attempt at doing, election day polling. Um, but here's the real reason to be a little skeptical. Given what we know about how strongly partisans are voting with their party and how little crossover voting there is, if you really had a 5 or 8 point Republican majority in the election, in the electorate, not the election day, but the full electorate, you would have to have an awful lot of Republican defections to have that number be true and to have Donald Trump lose by 0.6 of a point. So setting aside my polling or anything else, I think it's hard to reconcile those two numbers. There are problems with the way exit polls and VoteCast are weighted because they're weighted to match the actual vote, tabulated vote. But in weighting them to match that, you make them look accurate, but you may distort the percentages inside the crosstabs like party and vote in ways that aren't good. The Pollsters Association, APOR, has been holding panels on these issues with exits and now with VoteCast for a number of years now, and they haven't yielded any better approach to doing what they're doing, but there are these well-known issues. And I can only say we use the exits and we use VoteCast because it's hard to know what we would use that would be both better and as widely accessible to reporters and scholars and the public as those two sources are. But it is a difficult problem that there are some results out of those exits and VoteCast that seem implausible on the face of it, and this imbalance of party here in the state is an example of that.
Thanks.
Thank you to the journalists. I am back now, and I wanted to ask a few audience questions. The first one is, how is the Marquette University Law School Poll funded?
Sure, we're funded by alumni donations to the unrestricted annual fund. This has been on our methodology webpage with every poll release. It's public, it's there. All you have to do is turn to page 4 and read it. It's also been in our initial announcement of the poll in 2012, which is still on the law school website if people care to check it. But our funding is from alumni donations to what is loosely called the unrestricted fund. So it's not out of donations to build a building or to endow a professorship, but things that are given to the law school for worthy uses. It funds our legal clinics for the poor and for business startups. It funds our entrepreneurship clinic. It funds stipends for law students to work in public interest firms over the summer as a fellowship, and it also funds the law school poll.
Great, thank you. Somebody is also wondering if you thought the decrease in turnout in Black and Latino wards was due to lack of canvassing or lack of enthusiasm for Biden or the impact of coronavirus?
It's so hard to know the answer to that. Face-to-face canvassing is a big part of campaigns generally and has been a big part of Democratic campaigns throughout the state, but in urban areas and in the Black community as well. That's been changed. Also, the window for registration and early voting has been shifted a bit in recent years, in this year. But there's also the issue of COVID itself. There's also the issue of how well did Biden resonate with the especially younger Black voters. All of this, though, unfortunately, at this stage is just speculative. It's virtually impossible to tease out, certainly with publicly available data, anything about the direct contact or mobilization efforts or the electronic methods that may have been used. So I just have to confess that I don't think we know, I don't know, and it's going to be hard to get any kind of definitive answer to those questions.
And here's another question. You mentioned a shrinkage of 2 to 4% in the Black vote from Clinton to Biden. Did you see similar shrinkage patterns in other ethnic groups from Clinton to Biden? White voters, Hispanic, Asian, Native American.
Well,
voters?
the only ones that we're able to speak to right now have to do with the aldermanic wards in the city that are predominantly African American or Hispanic. And that's where I got the 2 to 4% decline in the margin for Biden in the 3 predominantly Black aldermanic wards, and a larger decline of about 7 or so in the predominantly Hispanic, the 2 predominantly Hispanic wards. And again, I added the caution, this is not a definitive estimate. It's simply the best we can do a week after the election to characterize the votes in those wards. But it doesn't necessarily mean it was Hispanic voters that were changing. There are other people in those wards who are not Hispanic that could have changed, just as in the Black predominant wards, there are other people who might have been changing. So I think it's important to add those cautions. However, given the expectations about the race, I do think it stands out as noteworthy that in those 5 wards, we saw everything from a very small to a somewhat more substantial fall off in Biden's margin.
State down ballot race polling showed Democrats' advantages that did not materialize in state legislative races. So can you comment on that miss? And then the second part of the question is, can we also attribute it to President Trump being on the ballot?
Yeah, I'm going to punt on this in that I've been completely focused on the presidential race since last Tuesday, and I have not looked at the legislative races or any of the referenda or other votes that were held in the state. So I'm just simply going to say I don't know the answer to that.
Well, that's fair. And one more question. The party coalitions seem to be changing. Would you elaborate on this? And do you think the changes are temporary based on Trump or more permanent?
Yeah, thanks. I did want to touch on this, so it gives me a chance to come back to it. We saw a growth in Republican Party identification between 2012 and 2016, where in the Marquette poll, we went from about 31% Democratic, 27 Republican in early 2012 to now, and really by the time we reached 2017, it's about 30% Republican, 29% Democratic. Almost all of that growth has come from white men without a college degree. In January of 2012, they were about 4 points more Republican than Democratic. But today, they're about 23 or 24% more Republican than Democratic. No other demographic group has shown any substantial change, certainly nothing close to that level of change. And so that almost single-handedly is why we've shifted to today essentially parity. It's 30 rep, 29 Dem. If you include people who lean to a party, then it's dead even 45-45. And hasn't changed over these last 4 years. But there is simultaneously a geographic shift in the state. Almost all of the counties in the Southeast, draw a line from Green Bay to the Iowa-Minnesota corner. Most of the counties to the southeast of that line have been becoming less Republican. Many of them, like the WOW counties, still give a majority to the Republican Party, but they give a smaller majority than they were. That also is now showing up in the Green Bay area in Brown, Outagamie, and Winnebago. But northwest of that line, most of the counties have moved in a Republican direction. Initially, clearly moving there for Trump in 16, but also moving there for Walker in 18, even as he was going from winning re-election to losing re-election, that northwest part of the state moved in his direction. And there are exceptions primarily in counties that have a substantial city in them, like La Crosse or Eau Claire. Not so much Marathon County and Wausau. But we are seeing this, we're seeing this shift. This time we also see a hint of it in St. Croix County, sort of exurb of the Twin Cities. So I do think there's a geographic redistribution taking place. I wanted to just give you the kind of stunning numbers for this, that in Ozaukee County, 8 years ago in 2012, Romney carried the county by almost 17,000 votes. And this year, Trump carried it by just over 7,000 votes, nearly a 10,000 vote shift in the net. And in Waukesha County, Romney carried it by 84,000, and this time Trump by just under 56,000, about a 28,000 vote drop. And so both of these counties still give Republican majorities, but together, statewide, they're giving 30,000 or so fewer votes to the Republican candidates. And that's a big shift. We're now seeing that in the Fox Valley a bit, and in some of the other counties. Eau Claire is moving in this direction. I mentioned St. Croix this time, though not in the past. So I think that geographic realignment is a fairly important thing that's taking place. Even as the party balance isn't shifting, the geography of that party balance is shifting. And it happens for Trump compared to Romney, but it happens for Walker in 18 compared to Walker in 16. It happens for Baldwin in 18 compared to Baldwin in 12. And it happens in all three of our Supreme Court races since 2016. And so this is not unique to Trump or to a particular party or a particular office. It's really pretty sweeping, and it's been persistent since 2012. Lost your audio.
Thank you, everyone.
There we go.
Thanks, everyone, and we'll you can watch it on our YouTube channel too if you'd like. Thank you.
Professor Franklin, thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Appreciate it.